HowToCatholic.
And welcome to HowToCatholic. My name is Tony, and I still don't have anyone on the podcast with me today, but that's okay because I'm planning on hopefully getting someone to be on with me next week. But I thought, for consistency's sake, let's just do a podcast night because these are honestly kind of fun to do, and it's better than me sitting at my computer writing stuff all day because I actually need to have social interaction except the fact that I'm talking to my computer right now and not an actual person. So, yeah, this is going to be my social interaction for today. If you were listening to the first 3 seconds of this podcast, you would have heard some great guitar playing by my friend, Mr. JT Harpel, who I went to and I was like, JT, I want you to record like a really short intro for my podcast. And he's like, okay. And I'm like, sweet. All you got to do is just like have your guitar and just go da 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 and then say HowToCatholic like really fast. And he's like, okay. And so we did it. And I was thinking, like, should I have, like, an actual song or something? And I'm like, well, then I have to write a song for this podcast. And I honestly do not feel like I deserve a song right now. At some point, I might write a very cool song. But for now, we are going to stick with the 3-second HowToCatholic video. And JT, if you're listening, you might have noticed I changed your voice a little bit on Audacity. But I told you I would do that, and you seemed okay with it. So, thank you, JD, for making that really cool intro. And now on with the rest of the podcast. I was on a retreat 2 weeks ago, and in one of the books we were reading on this retreat, we were discussing some stuff, and we had some materials to read. One of the books I was reading kept mentioning the word neighbor, like seriously over and over again. This one section we were reading, there was neighbor, neighbor, neighbor. And I was reading that word so many times, there was one person that came to my mind, Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers came to my mind while I was on this retreat, and I was telling people in my group that they kept saying the word neighbor. I kept thinking Mr. Rogers, and they laughed. And I wanted to talk about Mr. Rogers because really, I think he's such a cool guy, and I hope everyone who's listening has heard of or definitely seen Mr. Rogers, or maybe even grew up with his show, because for a while I did. But for people who for some reason don't know who Mr. Rogers is, I'll give you an idea. Mr. Rogers, he had a show on PBS. If you don't know what PBS is, it's the channel that you watch when you don't have cable, and that's literally the only thing that you can watch on your television. And that's what I grew up with. I grew up watching PBS and Mr. Rogers and Sesame Street and all those fun shows. And Mr. Rogers was such a cool guy, and I think that there's so much we can all learn from him. I found this video a while ago. It was a Vlogbrothers video done by John Green for Mental Floss, and he was talking about 35 things you didn't know about Mr. Rogers. I'll put it in the link description, but there's so much cool stuff about Mr. Rogers, and even though he was actually a Protestant minister, there's some really cool stuff that we can all learn from him and apply in our Catholic lives. So I'm just going to go through 3 quick things about Mr. Rogers. The first being is that Mr. Rogers, above all, he listened to people. It didn't matter if they were adults or kids. Anyone who stopped by his show, anyone who was, whether he was going through some sort of factory or he was just talking to a kid who stopped by to visit, he would listen to them. And he would also teach them. He would try and explain things to people, but he didn't, try and be over assertive or dominant in any way. No, he was loving and he was gentle and he was kind. And that's what we loved about him, is that he was such a kind, gentle soul. He was a great teacher. He loved meeting people. He loved talking to people. If you listen to John Green's video that I just mentioned, you'll see that there's so many instances where Mr. Rogers goes out of his way to make other people feel welcome. Apparently, he responded to every single piece of fan mail that ever came to him, and I'm imagining he got a lot of fan mail. So what does this have to do with our Catholic faith? Because really what he's doing there, he's exemplifying what Jesus tried to do when he was walking around and preaching to people. He was listening to them. He was with the people, listening to their concerns and their problems. And he would go and he would speak to them and speak gently and kindly. and lovingly to the people. I mean, there are a couple instances where Jesus would listen to the elders, and sometimes he would be, "Hey, you're going somewhere. You are actually listening to what I'm saying, and you are actually really close to the kingdom of God." And sometimes he didn't literally mean they were close to the kingdom of God, but he was always encouraging and always loving to everyone who ever came to him. And Mr. Rogers does that, or he did that so very well in his show. The second thing is that Mr. Rogers loved people just the way they were. He loved people, like I said. And there was a video that was, I'm not sure if it was made or if it was just released around the time of the September 11th bombing back in 2001. But this video kept going around of Mr. Rogers, and he was talking to the people, to the grown-ups who had watched his show when they were growing up, and the kids who were still watching the show. And he was saying, he was being encouraging and loving. And he said, "I love you just the way you are." And really, that's what people really need to hear. We live in a society where you're told you need to be and act a certain way. But Mr. Rogers wanted us to know that he loves us just the way they are. And that's how God is with us. He loves us just the way we are. Though, truthfully, he loves us just the way we are, but that doesn't mean that he wants us to stay the same forever. God always has big plans for us. He has hopes and dreams and desires for us. And he's hoping that by following him and listening to his call, that we will listen to what he wants us to do and how he wants us to spread his love to other people. But he still loves us. No matter who we are, no matter what we do, there is always love coming from God for every person. And I think that's really the most important thing. When I was graduating from college, at the end of our last Newman Center Mass, the seniors get to stand up and give a couple pieces of advice. And one of my pieces of advice was to follow the first commandment, which is to love people as yourself, to love God above all else, and love your neighbor as yourself. Love is God's message, and I hope that we will continue to listen to that message of love. Now, the third thing has to do with the Mr. Rogers theme song, and I hope you all know it, or sing it along with me, or at least sing it in your head. "It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine?" And that Mr. Rogers, to him, everyone was a neighbor. At the beginning of the show, he would say, "Hello, neighbor." No matter who you were always his neighbor. And that's what I mean when I was saying, love your neighbor as yourself, is that everyone's our neighbor. We should treat everyone with love. We should treat everyone with respect. Everyone should be our best friend. Well, not our best friend, but everyone should be our friend. And so Mr. Rogers had tons of people on his show, and no matter who they were, no matter what kind of job they had, or no matter what they were going through, he treated everyone the same. One of the great stories that I heard about Mr. Rogers is that he was at an executive party for the people at PBS, and he heard that his limo driver apparently was sitting out in his limo in the cold, and he said, "Well, bring him up." And so the limo driver got to go and hang out with all these PBS executives because Mr. Rogers wanted him to. And then on the way back, Mr. Rogers asked to sit in the front seat with the limo driver. And when he heard they were passing by the limo driver's house, he actually asked to go in and meet the limo driver's family. And they had a party, and Mr. Rogers was playing piano for them, and the neighbors came over, and it was awesome. So really, that's what Mr. Rogers wanted people to always remember, is that we are all neighbors. We are all connected. And that's what God wants us to remember too, no matter who we are, no matter whether it's nations or religions or ideals that separate us. We are all neighbors, and we should act like neighbors. We should be loving and caring for one another, because that is what God wants us to do. And I don't know, it's sad to think that Mr. Rogers is gone now. I mean, he's been gone for a while, but I wonder what he would have to say with the world that it is today. There are so many problems in this world. And yet I think he would continue that same message, that he loves us and that he loves us just the way we are. And he wants us to all be neighbors. That's what I got to say about that. And Mr. Rogers, rest in peace. You were awesome. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. And welcome back to How to Catholic. This is Tony. Now, for the next part of this podcast, I want to talk about anime. A specific anime, actually, and I'd like to give a review of this anime. Now, I normally do anime reviews on my blog, catholicbadass.blogspot.com, but I thought this anime deserved a more, where I could talk it out, because this isn't usually when I write about an anime on my blog. I want to write about animes where I'm like, here, go watch this. This is a good anime, and I recommend people enjoy it. And usually the animes that I write about, there's something that anyone, regardless of how many animes they watch or what kind of animes they watch, could sit down and enjoy, knowing full well, however, that it is anime and weird stuff always happens in this particular genre of media. It just kind of goes to the territory. However, this is an anime that I'm not going to recommend that you watch. If you want to watch it, go ahead. I'm not going to stop you. It's kind of like Game of Thrones. I'm not saying, well, don't watch it. But if you should watch it, you should know what you're getting into. That's what I talked about last week. But I watched it and I'm like, this is not that great. Like, this anime is not that great, but I want to keep watching it. And so I'm going to talk about it because I feel like it does deserve some mention. Okay, actually it's two animes, but it's, you know what, I'll explain it later. The anime that I want to talk about is called Genesis of Aquarion, or just Aquarion. Let's start with the plot. So 12,000 years ago, in this alternate Japanese, I guess, universe, these creatures called shadow angels, which some of them look humanly with wings. Others look just really, really creepy and weird. They appeared on Earth and they started killing humans for fun. Like, there's no other reason for it except they enjoy it. And then there was this one shadow angel named Apollonius who fell in love with a human named, I'm gonna say it wrong, Selene. I think that's it. That's probably it. Fell in love with a human, and he turns on the shadow angels and he starts fighting them using a giant robot that they find called Aquarion. And they both die for some weird. Well, they don't die. You'll see. Anyway, 12,000 years later, the shadow angels are back, and they start abducting humans for some weird reason. But there's this organization called Deva that is finding young teenagers, because really, why is it always the teenagers? They can't hire professional people who are old and mature and responsible to be in these mechs. It's always teenagers. But anyway, they find these teenagers who for some reason have special magical abilities, and they train them how to use Aquarion and fight back the shadow angels. And honestly, they're pretty bad at their job. Like, usually in a mech anime, the mech will run amok and destroy some stuff, but they'll never actually win. In this one, they capture humans all the time, and basically all Aquarion can do is stop them from taking everyone, because literally, if Aquarion didn't show up, it would just take everyone. But even with Aquarion there, they still take a pretty good number of humans for whatever weird reason that they're taking them. Anyway, enter this guy named Apollo, who finds himself in working for Deva through some reason that you'll see in the first episode. And it turns out that some of the people, including Apollonius and his human lover, reincarnated 12,000 years later, because it's anime. So there's reincarnation, apparently. And people are like, oh, he might be Apollo, but everyone's like, and some people are like, no, it's this other guy who has white hair, the same color as the bad guy in the anime, that is Apollo, the good guy. Anyway, enough about the plot. Anyway, giant mech fights, that's what happens pretty much every episode. Now, what I didn't like about it is that it's super repetitive and just it's kind of weird over time. It's almost like trying to be a kid's cartoon where, there's this overarching plot that is easy to follow, and they focus on individual characters throughout the season, and they help the characters overcome some problem or learn some sort of lesson by the end of the episode. However, when you have a series that only lasts 26 episodes, you can't spend all that time focusing on individual characters. Yes, they somehow play a role later in the series, but it got repetitive over time, and really the entire series is just super repetitive. I don't want to go into how repetitive it is, but you could literally watch 3 episodes and understand the entire rest of the plot. Yes, there is kind of a twist at the end of the series, but it's not that much of a twist, honestly. And the timing of the show was really weird also, where it starts out with, there's, one reason why the main character joined Deva. And then it kind of just sidetracks to making sure these individual characters in the show get their fair amount of screen time and they learn some sort of lesson. Then the last couple episodes, it actually jumps back into the main plot of the story. And it has not a nice ending, but it has a nice clean ending that for the most part makes sense. And yeah, I've looked online. There are mixed feelings about the show. Some people say, this is a great show, and others are like, this is a dumb show. And well, I'm, lean more towards the latter, where I'm like, this is not that great of a show. Apparently it's a tribute. It's a tribute to like the mech shows that were in the 1970s and 80s, which, had a Power Ranger plot basically, where, there would be some sort of talking going on between the Power Rangers, and they would try and learn something. Then a giant monster would show up, and they'd have to fight it off, and then everything would get resolved in half an hour. That's basically the plot of Aquarion. It's basically kind of Power Rangers, giant mechs and superpowered humans and everything. And, the music was good though. I enjoy the music. The art, so. Character development, there was not a lot. That was probably one of the weakest things in the show, is that they tried so hard to make sure these individual characters had some sort of character development, and yet there wasn't very much character development overall. They learned some sort of lesson by the end, these individuals did, but as a whole, they didn't grow so much. And honestly, they didn't even focus that much time on the main couple of characters. Well, there's one they kind of focused on, but he turns out a different way than you expect, or actually how you kind of expect at the end of the series. I know this is kind of confusing, but if you decide to watch it, I'm giving you an understanding of what you're really getting into. So anyway, this show ended, and I'm like, oh, okay. That wasn't bad. It was enjoyable. I enjoyed myself watching it. It was, it was a weekend where I didn't have anything going on. So I'm like, hey, let's just marathon a random anime. This only had 26 episodes. So I watched it. Now, there is a second season, which doesn't really make sense, but it totally works still. They weave it in very interestingly. And it was done a couple years afterwards, and it's done in a completely different style. The art is completely different, and except for the fact they make references back to the old show, they could have totally made this a completely different series. But they kept making references back to the old show. So this next season, which is also 26 episode, is called Aquarion and Evol, and it takes place another 12,000 years in the future. And now they have an organization called Neo-Deva, because, Deva is so old school, they got to have Neo-Deva. And instead of Aquarion in the beginning, they have 2 Aquarion-esque robots called Aquariuses, because in that Deva, the guys and the girls are separated. Guys take one Aquarius, the girls take the other. And this one guy, Amada, he ends up working for Neo-Deva, kind of like Apollo did. But he also meets this girl named Mikono, who is, let's just face it, they're reincarnations. You figure that out pretty freaking fast. They're all reincarnations. And, this show was actually a little bit better than the original Aquarion series. The music is still really good. They recycled a couple of tracks from the original Aquarion series, which I thought was awesome. because there's actually some really good songs in the Aquarius track. That was one of the strong things about the series, is that it had really well done emotional music. Anyway, the plot is that there's Neodeva. Instead of shadow angels, there are beings from another world, from the other side of the galaxy, are coming to Earth and stealing people. And it's like the same thing where Aquarius is trying to stop these beings from another world from stealing humans again. Until Armada, I don't know why I call them Armada, somehow unlocks the hidden power of the Aquariuses and turns it into the Aquarion, which apparently is forbidden for some reason. Anyway, there's more character development in the show, which I really liked. And they actually work to make sure characters got a fair amount of screen time, and that things were actually happening, and you spent less time focused on the giant mech robot fights. Because some episodes, they don't even have robot fights. It's more focused on the characters and on development and on the story itself, rather than seeing giant things blow up, which I kind of liked. It was enjoyable, and it was nice to mix things up every once in a while. It was kind of like if Power Rangers, one episode they decided not to fight a monster thingy, and instead, you just seen them hang around the house one day. That'd be kind of boring, but at least it'd be mixing it up a little bit. The art was really good, and the characters well done. And the ending, I thought, it was really good. It was super predictable, but it was one of those endings where you just finish the show, and you're like, wow, what do I do with myself now? There are a couple of animes that I've watched where I've finished them, I've turned off the TV, and I'm like, now what do I do? I feel kind of empty. Not empty as if I'm missing something in my life, but Aquarion and Aquarion Evol, I marathon these shows in a couple of days. So when I finish them, I'm like, well, now I don't have this thing to go back to. And it was either that or the show is, it has a really nice ending, a really sweet ending, that I was kind of like, okay, this is good. It was enjoyable. So that's what I want to say about these two shows. If you want to check them out, go ahead. If you don't, I understand. I did forget one thing, though. There is a lot of subtle and not so subtle references to inappropriateness. Like in anime, there's always, a little bit of appropriateness. It kind of just goes with the territory, except for some. Most of the animes that I review on my blog, there's no trace of inappropriate behavior or anything. Some material might be controversial, but it's still a pretty solid moral show. This one, it kind of just enjoys making the audience feel a little bit uncomfortable at times, just by the way things are phrased and what you see in the show. And it's enjoyable and you get a kick out of it, but I'm like, is this really necessary? Why am I watching this? Why did they decide to put it in here? So just recognize that was my big problem with the show, is that it really didn't take itself too seriously. If it had taken itself a little bit more serious, I probably would have enjoyed less if it had taken itself more serious. Because, you would have been like, well, they obviously knew what they were doing, instead of being like, yeah, they're just making fun of the fact that they know exactly what they're doing. They put that in there for a specific reason, and that was to mess around with the audience. But like I said, it's a pretty decent show. If you want to check it out, they're 26 episodes each. They're enjoyable. Just if you have a weekend where you're doing nothing and you just want to kick back and enjoy something, go ahead, watch it. I honestly don't see a reason not to, unless you're super uncomfortable by what I'm just talking about. Or you could also go online and check out trailers and other reviews, and my anime list has people posting things about whether you should watch it or not. But in the end, like everything else, it's up to you what you want to watch. And that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about this anime, not write about it, because I don't want to fully recommend it to people, but I just want to put it out there that, it's a good way to kill a weekend. So that's going to be it for me today. I ranted on that for a pretty long time, and hopefully some of it made sense and you understand what I'm trying to say with this review of Aquarion and Aquarion Evol. But with that, I am going to sign off for the night. Be sure to check out my blog, catholicbadass.blogspot.com, for further updates. And hopefully next week, I'm going to start having people on this podcast with me. Pray that will happen. Good night, everyone.